Unto the Hills by Margaret Walker Freel. Chapter 8. It was not necessary to erect homes for the immigrants. This valley had been occupied by Indians whose log houses remained when their occupants were taken to Oklahoma by the white man. In the big land sale following the removal of the Indians, John Wogg had taken tract number 45. This consisted of 294 acres and had been at one time an entire Indian village called Old Valley Town. During the Indian removal, Fort Delaney was erected on this tract to house the Indians while they were being collected to be transported to the west. Even prior to the departure of the Indians, many white families had entered and settled among the peace-loving Cherokee people. The first white man to enter the area was Archibald Russell Spence Hunter. The Hunter family of Scotch descent came to the New World at an early date. They first settled in Virginia. From Virginia, they migrated to Georgia. Around 1828, upon hearing about the Indian country, A.R.S. Hunter took his family and went to live in the Indian Nation, where he became a trader. He built a 2-story long house on the southwest shore of the Hiwassee River, near the junction of the Conaheet River, and furnished it with mahogany furniture transported on the backs of Indians up the mountains from South Carolina. In 1830, other white settlers came. John C. Moore, an Irishman, settled at Tusquity Valley and opened a trading post. He was soon joined by his brother, William P. Moore, and another settler, Douglas Davis. Also in 1830, the first white man, Abram Collett, settled in Old Valley Town. Abram was a Scotchman from Burke County who married Mary Stewart of Wilkes County. They built a 2-story log house in Upper Valley Town. Other settlers were old Thomas Tatham and his young son Tom, who built a grist mill on the creek. James Whitaker came and made his home a little to the west of Valley Town. He was soon joined by Gideon Morris. Whitaker and Morris established the first church in the community. It was known as the Valley River Baptist Church, but was open to all who wished to worship there. William Wogg, who had taken the land grant, had chosen the best house in the area for his own. Across the road in what had one time been the home of the Indian chief Junaluska, he set up his trading post with Billy Walker as his employee. Billy made a hazardous wagon trip to Savannah, Georgia, and brought back a small stock of goods. The trading post was now bartering with both white settlers and Indians. Salt, coffee, knitting needles, and such items were exchanged for more supplies. John Scott settled his family a short distance down the road on Junaluska Creek. In addition to farming, John assisted by the Tatham boys build a mill race and erected a grist mill. The Scotts and Woggs were scarcely settled when news came to the trading post of efforts being made towards organizing a county government. The County Court of Pleas and Quarter Sessions was called to meet in session on March 19, 1839. When the great day arrived, William Wogg even allowed Billy Walker to close the trading post so that the entire male population of the Valley River might attend the session. The Valley River delegation was led by James Whitaker, who had served in the House of Commons for Macon County. He had also headed the delegations to the state capitol with the request to partition Macon County, thus forming a new county to be called Cherokee County. Following a reading of the act which had been passed by the House of Commons relative to the duties of the duly elected county officials, the offices were filled. John Tatham was selected to serve as chairman of the assembly. Francis McGee became sheriff. James L. Hyatt, register of deeds. James Whitaker, clerk of Superior Court. Young Tom Tatham, county surveyor. Abram Collett, county ranger. P.A. Summey, standard keeper. John W. Grady, clerk of Court of Common Pleas and Quarter Sessions. And Neil Colvard, entry taker. The Valleytown delegation was pleased. They gained the lion's share of county officers. Thomas C. Tatham and James Whitaker were seasoned politicians. They had both served in the General Assembly in Raleigh. On the way home, the party threshed over the day's proceedings. Old Thomas, riding by Whitaker, said, Grandsire, you and Billy Walker did a good day's work. I'm proud we got so many officers from our part of the county. I'm pleased also at my boy Tom getting the surveyor's place and John being made chairman of the county court. Billy Walker will make a good justice of the peace. Your boys deserve it, answered Whitaker. I want to say, you watch that Billy Walker. I predict a big future for him. He's young, but he is smart. Mark my words, someday he will get John's place and serve as chairman of the court. The elections behind them, the people settled down to planting their gardens and getting ready for the growing season. Early spring was warm and promising, and the gardens were green and beautiful. When about the middle of May, a late frost put an end to the hopes of an early harvest. Many of the farmers had to completely replant. This proved to be a particular hardship on the new families who had arrived with the barest minimum of seeds for the first season's planting. However, the generous people were glad to divide with their new neighbors. So all the hard work had to be done again, this time with more success than the last. The year 1839 marked another milestone. The first grave was dug and the name Stalkup was chiseled on the headstone. This marked the grave of an infant daughter of the Stalkup family who were migrating through the area on their way further west. The child was taken ill when the family camped overnight in Valleytown. The sympathetic settlers tried to help. The only medical aid available to them was that of Grandma Collette, who tried all her remedies, but to no avail. The little girl died and was buried on a little hill in Lower Valleytown. It was always an important occasion when someone returned home after visiting in other communities. Word had gone out announcing the return of Stephen Whitaker. The men of Valleytown had gathered at the trading post to hear any news and to receive any mail that might be coming to them. Stephen had been on a trip to Franklin in Macon County, and today he was returning with news of special importance. He delayed his announcement as long as possible in order to build up suspense. Finally, he could hold it no longer. Cherokee County has 3 post offices now, he blurted out. Peachtree was named on March 15th. Felix Axley, our lawyer, has one at Rossville. The 3rd is over at Fort Butler. Old Man Hunter has it, and they're calling it Huntington. It's in his trading post. The next one will probably be here in Valleytown. The local residents were elated and immediately wanted to start working on the representatives in Congress to get one in Old Valleytown. Old Thomas Tatham addressed James Whitaker. Grandsire, you have the most pull in Washington. Take it up with our congressman and see if we can't get one. We will name it Jamesville for you if you succeed. Laughter followed this suggestion, but the group was serious about wanting the post office. The move to Cherokee County had been hard on Mary. For the second time in her life, she had picked up all her possessions and her loved ones and started a new life in an undeveloped wilderness. The country was beautiful, but she had begun in the very beginning all over again. The cherished box bushes had to be placed to make an avenue to the front door. Trees had to be set in the yard for shade. Fruit trees had to be planted and new gardens cleared, plowed, and planted. Along with all these chores, there was ever the 10 members of the family to feed and clothe. All the children were able to help, but Mary found herself depending more and more on the capable and loving hands of her firstborn for help and some comfort. Mary had been ailing the entire time since reaching her new home, so on Margaret's young shoulders fell the burden of many of the chores. She took on the supervision of all the farm chores usually handed to the women of the household, and added to these tasks of making soap, carding, dyeing, and weaving, as well as sewing and knitting. The work was hard and demanding, but Margaret managed it well. Sometimes, on rare moments, Margaret managed to slip away to be by herself. On these occasions, she walked up Junaluska Creek and stood watching the sparkling wildness of the stream. She hunted wildflowers in the summer and galax leaves in the winter. Margaret was able to thrive on the rigors of this pioneer life because she was happy. She was happy because she loved the mountains, from which she was able to gather strength and courage. She felt an inner peace and serenity and spiritual blessing as she silently communed with her mountains. She had truly found her home. It was fall, and early frost had already come. John Scott came home with an armload of new corn. "Mary, I brought some of our fresh corn. Can't we have some hominy for dinner?" John was happy with his first crop at the new home. Mary smiled and patted his arm. "John, your crops are fine this year. We are all proud of you and the crops, but we can't have hominy for dinner. We'll have it for supper. It takes several hours to make hominy. Margaret, go out and pour water in the ash hopper. We need about a gallon of lye. John, you must take some of this corn to the mill and grind it for bread. Mandy, you and Maria start shelling some of this corn so that we can let it dry in the sun for a day or so." When the water had dripped through the hopper, Margaret poured the lye into the big black kettle. She stood and watched the whole grains of corn as they slowly sank in the ugly dark liquid in the kettle. Then she returned to her chores. Later she returned to drain off the lye mixture. The corn was now a beautiful yellow color. She washed the corn in clean water until the husk all came off. Next she boiled the corn until it was tender hominy. At supper she put butter in the iron skillet and warmed the hominy before serving it. "Margaret," said John happily after he had tasted the hominy, "this is as good as your mother's. You are just about as good a cook as she is anyway." Margaret beamed at the praise from her father. "Pa, the old sow has had a litter of pigs," announced Abe as he came in a little late for his supper. "There's 9 of them." John forgot about supper as he hurriedly went to view his new litter of pigs. Food had been scarce that first year, and 9 new pigs meant lard and meat on the table, along with more pigs to breed and replenish his supply. One day, Mary was in her yard gathering flower seed to store for the winter. Suddenly, she heard a pounding sound. The blows came at regular intervals in measured beats. She paused and listened. The sounds increased. They couldn't be far away. Could it be Indians, Mary wondered? Maybe they're beating someone. She dropped her seeds and ran to the mill where she found John. Breathlessly, she asked, "John, do you hear that awful sound? It could be the Indians beating someone." John dropped the ears of new corn he was shelling for meal. "Mary, what's the matter?" He caught her to him and smoothed her disheveled hair. Then he walked to the door to investigate. There he heard the regular thud, 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 pulsating through the valley. His look of deep concern turned to pleasure. He smiled broadly as he said to Mary, "You are upset. That's only Elizabeth Whitaker battling her clothes. She learned it from the Indians." Mary smiled a little foolishly. "Oh, John, I'm so ashamed. I'd never heard of battling clothes. I must try it, though. Maybe it will help get the dirt out. What do they use?" "A battling stick," explained John. "I'll make you one, and you can see if it's of any use to you. Here, let's go home. You still seem a bit upset." Mary was visibly shaken, and she obediently took John's suggestion and followed him to the house. Later that evening, with the assistance of Grandma Collett, Mary once again gave birth to a baby girl, her 9th child. Another name was inscribed in the Brown family Bible: Harriet Hazeltine Scott, born November 1st, 1839. Chapter 9. The people of Valleytown had, with labor and toil and God's help, planted and harvested a bountiful crop. The entire population gathered at each home for corn shuckings. These aggregations were the feast of the harvest for the mountain folk. With one exception, each plantation had its corn crop shucked and in the sheds. The last shucking was planned for Abe Collett's home. Since Collett was the first white settler to come to the valley, he was looked upon as the patriarch of the settlement, and as such it was to be his honor to have the final celebration at his home. These corn huskings were a service to the neighbors, but above all a social affair and a time of thanksgiving for the bountiful goodness of God. Grandsire Whitaker stood before the assembled valley people at the Collett home and read the invocation. Following the religious service, there was feasting and merriment. The search for the red ear and its reward of a kiss was the subject of much bantering among the young men at the gathering. Billy Walker was the first one to find a red ear. Young Tom Tatham called, "Hey, Billy, "What are you going to do? You don't have a girl." Billy sat silently for a few moments. Then he rose, saying, "Yes, I do have a girl to kiss." He walked without hesitation and planted a kiss on the cheek of the startled, youthful Margaret Scott. Billy, then silent and dignified, returned to his seat. Margaret's face turned crimson, and she hastily buried it in her full skirts as the young people hooted in approval of Billy's bold and unexpected action. When the corn was all husked, the party began dancing. The dance was the mountain folk dance, and the music was banjo and fiddle. Young Jasper Tatham was caller, and young and old swung their partners till the house shook and quivered. Christmas followed rapidly on the heels of the celebration of the harvest season, and as is the case in many families where there are many children and little money, John and Mary were concerned about what to do for the children to make Christmas special. Also, in the early pioneer homes, with the demands of hard work and everyday living, time is almost as limiting a factor as money. However, John and Mary, with the assistance of their oldest daughter, managed to make a few gifts, such as corn-shuck dolls, checkers and whistles, and knitted scarves and socks, all of which were needed. After reading the Christmas story from the Bible, Mary put the little ones to bed with the assurance that Santa Claus would certainly find them away up in the mountains of western North Carolina. When the little ones were asleep, John brought in a cedar tree he had cut and placed it near the fireplace. Mary and Margaret draped it with garlands of white popcorn and hid the whistles and the corn-shuck dolls in its branches. Just as the last gift was placed under the tree, footsteps could be heard approaching the house. It was Billy Walker coming in from the trading post. He carried with him some bundles and letters. "Oh, Mother, why don't we put them under the tree and open them in the morning? Then we'll have some surprises on Christmas Day." Margaret's suggestion was taken, but Mary had trouble going to sleep herself because she was as excited as the children at the thought of opening letters and packages from home on Christmas Day. Though home was a log cabin which had once belonged to an Indian family and luxuries were unknown, this house held love, warmth, and peace. This happy Christmas seemed to place its benediction on the little family that had come to this mountain valley with their hopes and faith and willingness to work for a better life. Chapter 10. South Conaheet and Junaluska, which was rapidly becoming known as Scott's Creek to the newcomers, changed in the spring of 1840 from its serene, placid, kitten-like playfulness into a frightening, roaring, destructive monster. With the coming of the spring thaw and the added torrential rains, the swollen streams of the mountains were a force to be reckoned with, rather than a servant to be used. This stream beside which Margaret had daydreamed through the few stolen summer hours now struck terror in the hearts of the dwellers of Valleytown. John's gristmill on its banks was in danger of being carried away, along with their house, their garden, maybe even their very lives. The two families who had settled on this creek, the Scotts and Stephen Whitakers, kept vigil, constantly alert and in readiness to leave at a moment's notice. Hope was restored somewhat when Abram Collett stopped by the gristmill to check on his neighbors and to report. "The Indians have always said that Junaluska Creek never overruns its banks here." "Thanks, Abram," said John, feeling somewhat reassured at his message. However, one glance back at the turbulent green rushing water down the deep gorge was enough to restore the fear in his heart. "If it does get out of its banks, come up to our house. We have plenty of room." Abram then added, "That old Conaheet River, now, that's a different story. The Indians say it's bad to get out of its banks. It don't have the deep gorge to hold it like this one does." The Indians had lived by the Junaluska and Conaheet for many generations and knew of which they spoke. The Junaluska rushed and stormed in its gorge for several days, but then quietly settled back without ever quite reaching the top of its banks. As the Indians were right about the Junaluska, they were also correct about the Conaheet. It spread its murky, lapping waters for miles over the lush green valley below Valleytown and towards Murphy, the small, newly established county seat. Many stories are still told about the damages wrought by the Great Flood of 1840. Though his old gristmill was spared, John had to close it for a while to clean up the debris which had been carried into the mill race. It took him several weeks to clear the race and rebuild the dam. When the repairs were finally completed, the grist mill was overrun with customers. Meal made with a water wheel is a slow, tedious process. Such great numbers came to the mill that it had to be operated 24 hours a day. John ground during the daylight hours, and then Margaret and Abram took over the night duties. One night, Abram was ailing, and Margaret took the night's watch alone. While she was waiting for the slow process to finish, she knitted. By candlelight, she fashioned Billy Walker more warm socks. Margaret's scalp tingled. Her knitting needles paused in midair. There was a sound at the door. She picked up the candle and started backing towards the wall as she kept her eyes on the door. To her horror, the door slowly creaked back, and there, moving forward, was an animal with long, shaggy, black hair. "It's a bear. What'll I do?" thought Margaret incoherently. Then, realizing she was alone and too far from the house to be heard if she screamed, she reacted instantaneously in order to save her life. She set the candle on the shelf and picked up a pole her father used in the mill, and with superhuman strength, she brought it down on the head of the bear as it came towards her. The bear fell, rolled over, and groaned. The groan sounded more human than animal. This eerie sound coming from the bear tended to frighten Margaret even more. She lifted the pole to strike again. The bear moved, and a human voice spoke out, "My God, you've killed me." Margaret stood there trembling as she watched in disbelief and awe as a young man disentangled himself from the bear's skin. It was young Lee Tatham, who had come to the mill with the idea of playing a joke on Margaret. If frightening Margaret had been his plan, he certainly succeeded. However, he had not expected quite the violent reaction he got. Ruefully rubbing the large knot on his head, Lee said, "I'm sorry, Margaret. I thought it would be fun to give you a little scare. I guess the joke is on me." Margaret, still not quite recovered, replied, "I'm sorry I hit you so hard. I guess when you're scared you can do most anything." "Forget it. I deserved it. Now I know it really wasn't funny and I shouldn't have done it." Indian lore and history was of much interest to the settlers. Here they were making their homes in the beautiful valley that had once been the land of Cherokee. Some of these Indians had refused to be removed to Oklahoma and had hid out in the mountains until the soldiers left. Then they returned to their homes in the valley. Bushyhead was one of these Indians who still made his home in Old Valley Town. He learned something of the language of the newcomers, and they, in turn, picked up a few words of the Cherokee language. Together with this knowledge and some sign language, the two peoples were able to communicate. When Bushyhead made his appearance in the settlement, the white men never ceased to question him about the meanings of the Indian names. The older settlers continually told stories and tales that had been passed down through the generations. One morning at the grist mill, Bushyhead was being questioned about the meaning of the Indian names in the area. Conaheet, it means valley. Nautilus, it means daring horseman. Hiwassee, Indians say Owassee, mean big river. Junaluska tried, but failed. Old chief, he helped white man. Bushyhead had reached the limit of his ability to relate a story. Abram Collett, who had lived in the valley before the Indians left, had learned their language and knew many of their stories. He tried to fill in the gaps left by Bushyhead's narrative. The story goes that Hiwassee was the name of a beautiful Indian princess. She was the daughter of Catawba, the Indian chief. She was wooed and won by the Cherokee brave Nautilus, meaning daring horseman. Nautilus finally became chief of the Cherokee and made perpetual peace between the tribes. Following this, each man present began remembering Indian tales that he had heard. Old Thomas Tatham was the next one to recite. "I heard that the place where Murphy now stands used to be called Clawsuna, which means turtle. A big turtle at one time was supposed to live on the riverbank. There's also the tale of John Welch, a half-breed who killed a full-blooded Indian. Now this happened right here in Valleytown. The Indian's name was Leech. His nearest relation was Chief Yonaguski. According to their code, the nearest of kin must kill Leech's murderer. Welch, of course, took to his heels and finally got to Pickens, South Carolina, on the other side of the mountains. Old Chief Yonaguski, true to his assigned mission, followed Welch through the Smokies, Paint Rock, Newfound Mountain, and finally found him in Pickens. Here Welch had fallen in love with a white girl named Betty Blythe. When she heard that Yonaguski was planning to kill her lover, she went to the chief and begged him to spare Welch's life. The chief was moved by her earnest pleas and did not kill Welch. John Welch and Betty Blythe were married, and they lived down towards Murphy now. That Welch killed, I guess he's from Leech's place at Murphy. The Indians called it La Nushii, which is near where Conaheet joins Hiawassee. This was an Indian village and gathering place. They believed a great leech lived there in the river and churned the waters. It would kill and eat people. Then came another tale. At the top of Snowbird Mountain, to the right of Tatham's Gap, there is a bald. The Indians called it Tiyali Bald. They said once a big lizard with shining throat stayed on the bald, and they called it the Lizard Place. John Scott broke in and asked, "Isn't there some tale about a bluff on the Hiawassee River?" "Yes," said Abram Collett. "That is a famous one with the Indians. It is a rock cliff on the Hiawassee River below the county seat. The Cherokees told the story that lovers from different tribes, rather than to be separated, jumped off the cliff and killed themselves." Then Abram reached in his pocket and took out a small object. "Know what this is?" he asked. The others standing around took the object and inspected it. He continued, "It's one of them ferry crosses. I found this one soon after I came to Fort Delaney. The story the Cherokees tell is that the ferries wept when Christ was crucified. Their tears fell to the ground and turned into stones in the form of these little crosses. This is a reminder and a sign to the world of the crucifixion." "Where did you find it?" asked someone in the group. "I found this one at Brasstown. There are lots of them in that section of the county." This brought forth the suggestion that some of the men might want to go to Brasstown and take a look for the little crosses themselves. "Are they all alike?" asked John Scott. "No," retorted Abram. "Some are small, like this one. Others are larger. They are not all the same color. This one is light, but some are darker, almost black. I think they are pretty. I think this one brings me luck. Of course, I don't believe the Indian story, but it makes a pretty tale, and no one really knows how the crosses got there. I do know they're there, though." There was a period of silence as each of the men examined the tiny cross. Then John Scott asked, "Tatham, don't you know any good Indian tales?" "I've been here a long time, and I know plenty of tales," replied old Thomas Tatham. "John, did you know my boy Jim surveyed the road over Snowbird Mountain? He did it when the government built the roads to bring the Indians from Fort Montgomery to Fort Butler." "Tell us about the Indian forts. How many were there, and where were they located?" asked John. "There were 6 forts in North Carolina. Fort Butler was the chief fort in this section. It was the headquarters of the Eastern Division and also the biggest fort. The Indians were collected in the smaller forts, then taken to Fort Butler, and from there on the journey west. There were 12 buildings at the fort. It is on the west bank of the Hiawassee River, about the mouth of the Conaheet River. Fort Butler is now Murphy, our county seat. During the removal, thousands of Indians went through there. There were lots of soldiers there, too. General Winfield Scott stayed at Fort Butler part of the time. You know he was in charge of the removal." "He's my cousin, Uncle William's boy," broke in John. "I know it was wrong to take the Indians off, but I bet old Winfield did the best he could." Abram continued, "As I said, the other forts were smaller. Montgomery was the last one built. It's over in Chioa Valley. Fort Hembry was about 16 miles up Hiawassee River. Fort Lindsay was on the eastern side of the Nantahala River. Nantahala, that means land of the noonday sun. Then, of course, you all know Fort Delaney is right here in Valleytown. Abe, asked John, do you think it was right to run the Indians out of this country? No, I don't. Of course, it was the government that did it, but just the same, I guess we are all to blame. We moved in and took the land, didn't we? I agree, you're right. I've always felt that they were done wrong. It was their land and they had a right to it. We all came in and took the land. I'm as guilty as anybody. Why, this very land that Wog took grants on belonged to old Chief Junaluska. They say he wants it back. Some say he's on his way, walking all the way from Oklahoma to get back here to his land. I've heard that too, said Collett. I knew him well. He was a good man and I felt sorry for him. They say his wife died on the way out west. Lots of them died. When this country was first organized, some of us wanted to name the county seat for old Junaluska, but they named it for some old man way down east. Said he did a lot for schools in North Carolina. I don't know why that should make any difference. We didn't get any school up here. Oh, well, we did get the grant for Mount Pleasant, the academy at Murphy, but that's too far to do our young'uns any good. This last statement provoked a long discussion concerning the need for schools in the valley town. John Scott proposes starting a school with all the men getting together and putting up the building to house the school, and each family contributing to the support of the teacher. Grandsire Whitaker agreed with the proposal and reminded the group that the House of Commons had passed a law whereby the people in a county could take a vote on whether they wanted schools or not, and if they voted for schools, there would be a tax levied to support them. With this information in hand, several of the interested citizens in Cherokee County contributed their time and visited around, talking with their neighbors and urging them to vote for schools. Margaret Scott visited every home within several miles surrounding Valleytown and talked with the women. Billy Walker talked to each customer who entered the trading post. By the time the election was held, the vote for schools far exceeded the vote against schools. Just as there were families making their way to Cherokee County to farm, there were others coming who had received grants for the land on which to mine ore. George Lovingood and his brother took grants of 3,000 acres on Hanging Dog Creek. In return for the grants, which had been given by the state, they were required to mine a certain amount of ore for the state. 2 other families came to the county to pursue the mining occupation. They were A.H. Killian of Burke County and a man by the name of Mercer Fain. When Mary Scott brought her 9th little girl into the world, Cherokee County had become a modern county in which the little girl would grow up and get proper schooling. Once again, the family Bible was placed in Mary's lap, in which she lovingly recorded the name of her 10th child, Laura Elizabeth Scott, born December 13, 1841.